Arthur Finch's diner was just days away from being a ghost, a memory swallowed by debt and foreclosure. The bills were stacked so high on his small office desk they cast a shadow, a constant, paper-thin reminder of his failure. Outside, the whispers of his neighbors had turned to open mockery, their pity curdling into scorn. And yet, through it all, he kept the coffee pot on and the grill hot, feeding any stranger who wandered through his door with the weariness of the world on their shoulders. One rain-slicked Tuesday night, he served his very last portion of stew to a quiet, shivering black man, a man whose coat was more holes than fabric. He deliberately ignored the snickering from the corner booth, the familiar refrain that his own kindness was the anchor dragging him under. But when the bank officers, flanked by uniformed sheriffs, finally arrived to lock his doors for good, a silent procession of black SUVs glided to the curb, their tinted windows reflecting the diner's flickering sign. The passenger door of the lead vehicle opened, and the very same man everyone had dismissed as a nameless vagrant stepped out. He was dressed in a charcoal suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed to absorb the bleak morning light and radiate quiet power, a presence that hushed the entire street into a state of stunned disbelief. Arthur Finch's diner, the corner spoon, looked like a place that had fought a long, losing battle with time and lost gracefully. A chipped neon sign, shaped like a coffee cup, sputtered a weak, buzzing protest against the persistent, soul-dampening drizzle that had plagued the town all week. The rain washed the grit from the streets into the gutters, but it couldn't wash away the feeling of defeat that clung to the block. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of 1,000 breakfasts, the comforting scent of fried bacon, burnt toast, and industrial-strength coffee was a permanent fixture, mingling with the faint, earthy smell of damp wool that slipped in each time the bell above the door chimed. The booth sat empty, a graveyard of cracked crimson vinyl, whispering tales of countless conversations. Crumbs from the morning's meager business dotted the tables, and the only sound was the low, rattling hum of a refrigerator that was older than Arthur himself. Arthur stood behind the counter, a tall man made to look smaller by the slump of his shoulders. He wiped the same spot on the formica countertop with a faded rag, the motion slow and hypnotic. It wasn't about cleaning anymore. It was a ritual, a way to keep his hands moving while his mind raced, a desperate attempt to distract himself from the stark, red-stamped final notice locked in the office drawer he hadn't dared to open since it arrived. People around town had a diagnosis for his condition, terminal generosity. And perhaps they were right. It felt like a sickness sometimes, this inability to say no. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the weary rooftops, someone new would find their way to his door. A young mother with 2 children whose eyes were too large for their faces. An elderly man whose hands shook so badly he could barely hold a fork. A young man, no older than 20, with blisters on his feet from shoes that had given up long ago. Arthur never turned a single one away. He'd wordlessly slide a plate across the counter, offering a quiet nod that said, "I see you." To him, it wasn't charity, it was a fundamental law of existence, a creed he'd inherited from his late wife, Martha. "If you have a flame, you share the light," she used to say. So he'd mutter to himself as he worked the grill, a quiet prayer to her memory, "If I can cook, they can eat." That night, the bell jingled with a hesitant, almost apologetic chime. A figure was framed in the doorway, a silhouette against the weeping gray sky. He was a black man, gaunt and soaked through, his thin coat clinging to his frame like a second, sodden skin. The man's beard was patchy and untrimmed, his eyes were cavernous, sunk deep into their sockets, and his hands trembled with a violent, uncontrollable shiver, as if the bitter cold had burrowed deep into his marrow. Arthur's exhaustion momentarily vanished, replaced by a familiar, instinctual compassion. He didn't hesitate. He gestured with his rag toward the nearest booth, his voice warm and rough. "Come on in, friend. Get out of that rain. Sit down, you're freezing." The man didn't reply, offering only a slow, weary nod. He shuffled forward, each step a monumental effort. He carried with him the scent of rain-soaked asphalt and the profound exhaustion that comes from too many nights spent on unyielding concrete. Arthur moved with practiced efficiency. He poured a thick, white mug full of steaming black coffee, his own hands wrapping around it for a moment to feel its warmth before setting it down. He followed it with a bowl of chicken stew, the last of the pot, and a small plate with 2 slices of buttered bread. From a jar he kept by the register for his own headaches, he slid over a couple of aspirin. From the corner booth, where 2 of his remaining regulars, Frank and Gus, were nursing their own coffees, a stage whisper cut through the quiet diner. "There he goes again," Frank muttered, a retired hardware store owner whose heart had shriveled with his business prospects. "That's the whole problem right there. Giving away the inventory to every drifter who blows in." Gus, who'd spent 40 years sorting mail and now spent his days sorting the town's gossip, snorted in agreement. "He's got a heart of gold and a head full of rocks. He'll be boarding this place up before the first snow. Mark my words." Arthur's jaw tightened into a hard knot. He could see their smirking reflections in the polished chrome of the espresso machine, but he refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Defending himself felt pointless. What could he say that they would ever understand? Let them think him a fool. He had long ago stopped caring about their judgment. His focus was on the man in front of him, who was now cradling the warm mug in his trembling hands, the steam rising to mist his face. The stranger ate with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed out of place with his desperate appearance. He sipped the stew, his eyes fixed on Arthur. It was a strange, unnerving stillness, as if he were cataloguing more than just the meal. He seemed to be studying Arthur himself, the way he methodically refolded the rag and tucked it into his apron string, the quiet sigh that escaped his lips when he thought no one was listening, the genuine concern that softened the tired lines around his eyes. Every gesture, every unconscious act of a man worn down to his foundations, was met with an intent, penetrating gaze. And though Arthur couldn't possibly know it, that silent observation carried infinitely more weight than all the jeers and whispers in the world. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, drumming a frantic, relentless rhythm against the large plate glass window. Arthur rubbed his weary eyes, oblivious that the quiet, sodden man in the booth had just set in motion a chain of events that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. The next morning, weak sunlight struggled to pierce the diner's foggy windows, illuminating streaks of dust and grime on the glass that Arthur no longer had the energy to wipe away. The room was mostly deserted. Frank and Gus occupied their usual corner booth, their voices echoing in the empty space, sharp and critical. "Poor sap's too soft for this world," Frank declared, vigorously stirring a mountain of sugar into his cup. "This isn't a soup kitchen. It's a business. Or, it was." "Soft?" Gus scoffed, his laugh a dry, rattling sound. "That ain't softness, Frank. That's pure, grade-A stupidity. You don't give away your product when the bank is breathing down your neck. It's financial suicide." They both chuckled, a shared moment of grim satisfaction, shaking their heads as if Arthur were a local cautionary tale, a living museum of bad decisions. Arthur, behind the counter, pretended he was deaf. He moved with a forced, deliberate calm, meticulously refilling salt shakers that were already full, straightening a crooked stack of paper napkins. Anything to keep his hands from shaking. His apron, once a crisp white, was now frayed at the edges and stained with the ghosts of 1,000 splatters. A thin sheen of sweat beaded on his brow, a cold sweat born of anxiety, not heat. But he felt their words like tiny, sharp stones hitting his back, each one weighing more than the thick stack of overdue invoices waiting for him in the back. By mid-afternoon, just as Arthur was considering closing up early to save on electricity, the stranger returned. He wore the same ragged coat, still damp from the previous night, and moved with the same quiet, shuffling steps. Arthur looked up from the grill, where he was frying a single egg for his own late lunch. He simply nodded toward an empty booth, a silent invitation. The man lowered himself onto the vinyl seat, his movements slow and pained, as if his body were a machine whose gears had rusted over. "You again," Arthur said, his voice softer than he intended. He slid his own plate, one egg and a piece of dry toast, in front of the man. "Here. You need it more than I do. Eat up." No arguments. The man's hand, though still marked by a slight tremor, seemed steadier today as he picked up the fork. He didn't speak, but his eyes, clear and surprisingly sharp, never left Arthur. They tracked him with an unnerving focus as he went through the motions of running an empty diner, wiping down counters that were already clean, greeting the one or two customers who trickled in, and constantly checking the old, plastic-rimmed clock above the door, as if he could physically see the seconds of his life's work ticking away. Word of Arthur's persistent folly spread through the neighborhood like a virus. What was once seen as eccentric generosity was now being openly discussed as a sign of weakness, of a man who had lost his grip. The consequences were becoming tangible. Suppliers, who had once extended him credit on a handshake, started demanding cash up front. A delivery of potatoes and onions never arrived. When he called his produce guy, Stan, a man he'd known for 20 years, the answer was curt and cold. "Sorry, Art. I can't float you anymore. Pay what you owe, then we can talk." That evening, as Arthur stepped into the alley to toss the day's single, half-empty bag of trash, he saw two of his neighbors, the Henderson brothers, leaning against a lamppost, smoking. "It's a damn shame," one of them muttered, just loud enough for Arthur to hear. "The man is drowning and he's still handing out life rafts." The other brother flicked his cigarette into a puddle, the butt hissing for a moment. "Don't feel sorry for him. He chose this. You can't be a saint and a small businessman. Sooner or later, you gotta pick 1 inch." Arthur froze, the trash bag heavy in his hand, their casual verdict echoing in the damp air. For a fleeting, bitter moment, a seed of doubt took root. Were they right? Was this all just a fool's errand? A slow, drawn-out suicide mission for a principle no one else seemed to value? But then, his mind conjured the faces of the people he'd fed just this week, the hollowed-out eyes of the young man with the ruined shoes, the grateful, tired smile of the young mother, the silent, intense gaze of the man currently sitting inside, eating as if it were the first proper meal he'd had in a month. And just like that, the doubt withered and blew away like ash. Inside, under the faint, buzzing glow of the fluorescent lights, Arthur leaned heavily on the counter, the exhaustion of the past few months carved deep into the lines of his face. He didn't see it, but from his booth, the stranger's gaze softened with something that looked like understanding, as if he recognized the profound weariness of a man fighting a battle on principle alone. The whispers outside grew louder, more certain of his imminent demise, but Arthur kept unlocking the door each morning. And the man kept coming back, always silent, always watching. The week stretched on, pulled taut like a rope about to snap. By Tuesday, Arthur was operating on fumes, cobbling together meals from the forgotten dregs of his pantry. A half bag of pinto beans, a few withered onions, a crate of bruised tomatoes he'd bought for pennies from a farmer's market vendor who'd taken pity on him. He stirred pots of thin soup with a heavy arm, a knot of dread tightening in his chest every time he glanced toward the office. On Thursday morning, the mail carrier pushed a thick, menacing envelope through the mail slot. It was stamped with bold, red letters that screamed final notice. Arthur sat at the counter for a long time, his thumb tracing the sharp edge of the seal, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He didn't need to open it. He knew its contents as surely as he knew his own name. When his trembling fingers finally tore it open, the cold, bureaucratic words confirmed his deepest fear. Foreclosure. Unless the full, impossible sum was paid within 48 hours, the diner would be seized by the bank. That evening, the diner was quieter than it had ever been. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the old fridge and the soft clink of the stranger's spoon against a chipped porcelain bowl. Arthur had made one last, meager meal, a simple dish of beans and rice. He sat in the booth across from the man, two empty coffee mugs standing between them like sentinels. The man ate slowly, his dark eyes fixed on Arthur's face. For a breathless moment, Arthur thought he was finally going to speak, to offer a word of thanks or perhaps even condolence. But no words came. There was only that same steady, unreadable, and deeply unsettling stare. The next morning, they arrived. Two sheriff's deputies, their uniforms crisp and their faces impassive, pushed through the diner's door, followed by a pale, thin man in an ill-fitting suit. The man, a Mr. Jennings from the bank, clutched a clipboard to his chest like a shield, his eyes darting around the small, shabby room with the detached air of a vulture circling its prey. "Mr. Arthur Finch?" one of the deputies asked, his voice polite but firm. Arthur nodded, his throat suddenly as dry as desert sand. He couldn't force a single word out. Mr. Jennings stepped forward and began to speak in a cold, official monotone, explaining the legalities. The property was being repossessed. He had until 5 o'clock that evening to vacate the premises. The few customers present, including Frank and Gus, watched the scene unfold from their booths. A wave of whispers spread through the room like wildfire. "Told you," Gus hissed to Frank. It was only a matter of time. "All that free food finally came home to roost," Frank added, a note of grim vindication in his voice. Arthur stood frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly his knuckles turned bone white. He could hear their gossip. He could feel every patronizing, pitying stare burning into his back. But he didn't protest. He didn't argue. What was the point? They were right. He had failed. And then, a new sound cut through the tense atmosphere. The soft, authoritative crunch of expensive tires on wet pavement. A line of 3 immaculate black SUVs had pulled up directly in front of the diner, their engines purring with a low, intimidating growl. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. The deputies at the door instinctively straightened up, their hands moving closer to their belts. Mr. Jennings's reedy voice faltered. The rear door of the first SUV swung open with a silent, hydraulic hiss. And from it emerged the man who had shuffled into Arthur's diner night after night. But the transformation was staggering, almost terrifying. The ragged, filthy coat was gone, replaced by a dark, custom-tailored suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, gleamed under the gray morning light. His beard was no longer patchy but neatly, expertly trimmed, and his posture was no longer stooped with weariness but ramrod straight, radiating an aura of immense power and control. Behind him, 2 assistants in equally sharp suits emerged, carrying thick leather briefcases. The diner fell into a tomb-like silence. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Even the deputies seemed to be holding their breath. The man walked forward, his expensive shoes making a soft, deliberate tapping sound on the worn linoleum floor. His gaze was locked on Arthur, and in his eyes, there was no trace of the broken man from the night before. Arthur's chest heaved, his breath catching in his throat as a wild, impossible truth began to crystallize in his mind. This man was not who he had pretended to be. And the revelation that was about to unfold would be bigger, more seismic, than Arthur or anyone else in that stunned, silent room could ever have possibly imagined. The diner felt like a pocket of frozen time. The persistent hum of the refrigerator, the drip of the leaky faucet, the very air itself seemed to have gone still as the man in the suit came to a halt inside. The sound of his footsteps on the worn floorboards echoed with an unnatural clarity in the cramped, silent space. Arthur's hands, which had been clenched into fists on the counter, slowly uncurled. The faded rag he always held, his nervous habit, slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor with a soft, unnoticed thud. The man stopped just a foot away, his presence so commanding it seemed to shrink the room around him. He studied Arthur's pale, stunned face for a long, deliberate moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he placed a thick, leather-bound folder on the counter, the sound a sharp crack in the silence. When he spoke, his voice was not the hoarse whisper Arthur had imagined, but a calm, resonant baritone that carried an authority that instantly rendered the bank official and the deputies irrelevant. "Mr. Finch," he began, his eyes holding Arthur's. "My name is Marcus Thorne. And these," he tapped a manicured finger on the folder, "are the deeds to this building. As of 10 minutes ago, the mortgage has been satisfied. Every outstanding debt, every supplier invoice, every utility bill, has been paid in full. This diner, It's yours now. Free and clear. A collective gasp swept through the few customers. The deputies exchanged a confused glance, suddenly unsure of their purpose. Mr. Jennings's jaw dropped, the clipboard slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. Arthur just blinked, his mind struggling to assemble the words into a coherent thought. He shook his head slowly, a gesture of pure, uncomprehending disbelief. I don't understand. Mr. Thorne's expression softened slightly. You gave me food when I was invisible to everyone else. You gave me warmth when I was freezing. You offered me dignity when I had none. You did this not once, but night after night, even as your own world was crumbling around you. You did it when people were laughing at you, telling you that your compassion was your flaw. He gestured vaguely, as if to the memory of his disguise. I came to this town looking for a place to build, to invest. But before I invest in property, I invest in people. I needed to know if the heart of this community was still beating. So, I dressed like this. I wanted to see character in its purest form, when it expects no reward. I tested you, Mr. Finch. And you passed in ways I could not have possibly anticipated. A shocked murmur rippled through the diner. Frank and Gus, in their corner booth, stared wide-eyed, their faces flushing with a sudden, hot shame. The billionaire continued, his voice resonating with purpose. I am launching a major urban renewal project in this district, Mr. Finch. I've been quietly observing this neighborhood for months. I've seen the way you treat people. You're not just a diner owner, you're an anchor. You're the soul of this place. And men with your kind of integrity don't deserve to sink. They deserve to be lifted up. He pushed the folder closer to Arthur's trembling hands. This is just the beginning. The diner is yours, that's a gift. But I have a business proposition. I don't just want to save the corner spoon. I want to expand it. I want to open 3 more, just like it, in other neighborhoods that need a place with a heart. I want to fund a citywide program, run out of your kitchens, to feed the homeless. Your vision, your principles, but with my capital. If you'll let me, Arthur, I will back you every step of the way. A knot formed in Arthur's throat, thick and painful. His hands hovered over the leather folder, shaking. The whispers in the diner had now completely transformed. The mockery was gone, replaced by a tone of hushed, reverent awe. Can you believe that? Someone whispered. He was right the whole time. Kindness, another voice added softly. It actually came back to him. Tears, hot and sudden, welled in Arthur's eyes. He fought to blink them away, but they spilled over, tracing paths through the weary lines on his face. He finally reached out and pressed his palm flat against the cool leather of the folder, the solid reality of it a grounding force against the surreal tide of emotion. This wasn't a dream. He looked up at Marcus Thorne, the man who had been a ghost, a symbol of his failure, and was now his savior. He saw no pity in the man's eyes, only a deep and profound respect. Arthur finally found his voice, a ragged whisper. Thank you. Outside, as if on cue, the relentless drizzle finally ceased. A brilliant, unexpected shaft of sunlight broke through the heavy gray clouds, pouring into the diner and illuminating the floating dust motes like tiny diamonds. The light struck the cracked neon sign, making it glow with a vibrancy it hadn't possessed in years. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Arthur felt the warmth of the sun on his face. And though his entire life had just been rewritten in the span of 5 minutes, he knew, with absolute certainty, that one thing would never change. Tomorrow morning, when he unlocked these doors, his doors, anyone hungry, anyone beaten down by the world, would still find a hot meal and a warm seat at his table. Because in the end, it wasn't his business acumen that had saved him. It was the simple, stubborn, and foolish belief that if you can cook, they can eat.